It started like any other day. The intercom buzzed, and Principal Thompson's calm voice filled the school. Attention, all students and staff, we are going into lockdown. This is not a drill. My heart skipped a beat. I was in Mr. Hayes' math class, 3rd period. The fluorescent lights above us flickered slightly as the news sank in. Mr. Hayes, usually composed, had a fleeting look of panic before he pulled down the blackout shades and motioned for us to huddle in the corner away from the door. We obeyed without question. The door was locked with a heavy click, the lights switched off, and we were plunged into a darkness that was more psychological than physical. The only light came from the thin slivers that escaped through the cracks of the shades. We were used to drills, but something about this felt off. There was no chatter, no awkward giggles that usually accompanied these exercises. Just silence. Thick, suffocating silence. Minutes ticked by, and the silence grew more oppressive. Then, faintly, a sound. It was hard to place at first, a sort of muffled thumping. It grew louder, more distinct. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoing through the empty halls. We exchanged glances, fear in our eyes. Mr. Hayes raised a finger to his lips, his expression stern. We stayed still, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps grew closer. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. The slow, rhythmic cadence was unnerving. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure whoever was out there would hear it. Then came the whispering. Low, unintelligible murmurs, almost like a conversation between two people. It sent chills down my spine. But when I strained to listen, it seemed like the whispers weren't coming from just outside the door, but from all around us. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block it out, but the whispers only grew louder, overlapping, filling the room with an oppressive weight. I opened my eyes and saw my classmates' faces, pale and strained, reflecting my own fear. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped right outside our door. The doorknob rattled, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. Mr. Hayes stood up, inching towards the door as quietly as possible. The rattling continued, then stopped abruptly. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a loud bang, something struck the door. We all jumped, a few gasping in shock. The door shuddered under the impact, but thankfully held. A faint sound, like a dragging noise, followed. Whatever was out there seemed to move away, the dragging sound fading down the hall. Mr. Hayes looked back at us, his face ashen but determined. We waited in silence, the air thick with tension. The whispers had ceased, and all that remained was the eerie stillness. It felt like hours before the intercom crackled to life again. "Attention, all students and staff." Principal Thompson's voice was shaky, barely recognizable. "The lockdown is over. You may resume normal activities." Mr. Hayes hesitated, then slowly turned the lights back on. The relief was palpable, but it didn't erase the fear that still gripped us. We all knew something was very wrong, but we were too shaken to speak. As we gathered our things and prepared to leave, I noticed something odd. The door, the one that had been locked, now had deep gouges in the wood, like something had clawed at it. I looked at Mr. Hayes, but he just shook his head as if urging me not to ask. We filed out of the classroom, and as I stepped into the hallway, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The hallways were eerily empty, the usual bustle of students absent. I could still hear the faint echoes of those whispers in my mind, and I knew that whatever had happened today was far from over. The school was never the same after that. Strange things continued to happen. A locker would suddenly burst open with nothing inside. The lights would flicker without reason, and students swore they heard whispers when no one was around. Teachers and staff brushed it off as nerves, but we all knew the truth. Something had entered our school during that lockdown, something that should never have been let in. And even though we tried to go back to normal, the silence in the hallways was always there, reminding us of the terror that lurked just out of sight.
The announcement came during fifth period, right after lunch. We are now in lockdown. This is not a drill. Miss Jensen's history class froze as the message repeated. She moved swiftly, closing the blinds and locking the door, her hands trembling only slightly. We all moved to the designated corner of the room, huddling together like animals seeking warmth. I sat between my best friend Alex and a girl I barely knew from gym class. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. After what felt like an eternity, I glanced at my phone. No messages, no updates. The school's Wi-Fi was down, and the silence outside the classroom felt unnatural. Usually you'd hear the shuffling of feet or the faint murmur of distant voices, but now, there was nothing. The minutes dragged on, each one heavier than the last. My mind wandered, thinking of every possible scenario. Was it an intruder? A shooter? My heart pounded with a mix of fear and anticipation. Then, the lights flickered. Once, twice, then went out completely. Darkness swallowed the room, and a collective gasp escaped us. Miss Jensen's voice, usually so confident, trembled as she whispered for us to stay calm. That's when we saw it, a faint red glow coming from the door's window. It wasn't like any light I'd ever seen, pulsing softly like a heartbeat. It illuminated the hallway beyond in a dim, eerie hue. We all stared at it, transfixed. The red light seemed to throb, growing brighter and then dimming rhythmically. It cast strange, distorted shadows through the small window, shadows that moved in unnatural ways. Miss Jensen slowly got up, motioning for us to stay put as she crept towards the door. She peered through the window, and I saw her face pale as if the blood had been drained from it. She stumbled back, her hand covering her mouth, and the look in her eyes was one I'd never seen before. Pure terror. "What is it?" Alex whispered, but she didn't respond. Instead, she backed away from the door, her gaze fixed on the window. The red light grew brighter, almost painfully so, forcing us to look away. But something compelled me to look back, to see what was causing it. That's when I noticed the shapes in the hallway. They weren't shadows. They were figures. Human-like, but wrong. Their limbs were elongated, their movements jerky and unnatural, as if they were marionettes being controlled by invisible strings. Their eyes, or at least where their eyes should have been, glowed with the same red light. They moved slowly, methodically, their heads turning as if searching for something. And then, one of them stopped in front of our door. It raised a hand, a long, bony finger tapping against the glass. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was soft, almost delicate, but it sent a shockwave of fear through the room. No one dared move or breathe. The tapping continued, growing more insistent, almost impatient. Then, the handle of the door began to rattle, and I felt the blood drain from my face. Miss Jensen stood frozen, her eyes wide with fear. The rattling grew louder, more violent, but the door held. Suddenly the red glow began to fade, the figures retreating into the darkness of the hallway. The tapping ceased, and all that remained was the oppressive silence. We stayed huddled together, too afraid to move, even after the lights flickered back on. When the announcement came that the lockdown was over, none of us moved. It took several minutes before Miss Jensen found the courage to unlock the door. The hallway was empty. The red glow gone, as if it had never existed. But the fear lingered, a dark cloud that would not lift. In the days that followed, rumors spread about what had happened. Some said it was a gas leak, others that it was a test gone wrong. But we all knew the truth, even if we didn't speak of it. The school was different after that day. There were whispers of strange occurrences, students disappearing for hours with no memory of where they'd been, and that red glow occasionally seen in the darkest corners of the building. We tried to go back to normal, but every time I passed by that classroom, I could feel the unease creeping back in. The memory of those figures, those distorted shadows, haunted my every step, a constant reminder that something sinister had entered our world and was still out there, waiting for the next moment to strike. It was the middle of sixth period when the announcement came. Students and staff, we are now in lockdown. Please secure your rooms immediately. The voice was unfamiliar, not our usual principal's calm tone. It was robotic, almost inhuman, and it sent a chill down my spine. Mrs. Carter, our English teacher, quickly locked the door and pulled down the blinds, her movements stiff and mechanical. She ordered us to the corner, her voice lacking its usual warmth. The room was filled with an uneasy silence, punctuated only by the occasional creak of the old school building. The blinds didn't block out all the light, leaving a faint, ghostly glow that barely illuminated the faces around me. I could see the fear in everyone's eyes, mirroring my own. As we huddled together, I noticed something odd. The walls seemed off. The familiar cream-colored paint appeared darker, as if a shadow was slowly creeping across it. I blinked, thinking it was just my imagination. But when I looked again, the shadow had grown. My heart raced. I nudged my friend Jessica, pointing to the wall. She squinted, then gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. The others noticed too, their eyes widening in horror. The shadows on the walls weren't just spreading, they were moving, slowly, methodically, like ink bleeding across paper. And within the shadows, shapes began to form. Dark, indistinct shapes that writhed and shifted, growing clearer with each passing second. Eyes, hundreds of them, all sizes, blinking and staring at us from the walls. They weren't human eyes. They were too large, too luminous, with pupils that seemed to spiral inward. They darted around the room, settling on each of us in turn, studying us, analyzing us. I could hear the shallow, panicked breaths of my classmates, the soft whimpers of those too scared to keep silent. Mrs. Carter stood frozen at the front of the room, her eyes locked on the wall behind us. Her face was pale, her knuckles white from gripping the edge of her desk. The eyes seemed to pulse with a life of their own, their movements hypnotic, drawing me in. I felt a strange compulsion to stand up, to move closer to the wall, to let them see me more clearly. I fought the urge, biting down on my lip until I tasted blood. Suddenly the intercom crackled to life again, that same robotic voice filling the room. Attention, do not engage, do not look directly at them. Too late. We had already looked, and now we couldn't look away. The eyes began to move closer, the shadows extending towards us like tendrils. I could feel the coldness emanating from them, a deep, bone-chilling cold that made my teeth chatter. The room was suffocating, the air thick with fear. Jessica squeezed my hand, her grip so tight it hurt, but I welcomed the pain. It kept me grounded, kept me from succumbing to the overwhelming terror. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, the eyes began to fade, retreating into the walls. The shadows receded, and the room slowly returned to its normal state. But the sense of dread remained, hanging heavy in the air. The intercom buzzed again, but this time it was the principal's voice, shaky and unsure. "The lockdown is over. Please proceed to your next class." No one moved. We were too stunned, too shaken to even comprehend what had just happened. Mrs. Carter finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, telling us to gather our things and leave quietly. As I stood up, I couldn't shake the feeling that the eyes were still there, watching us, waiting for the right moment to reappear. The hallway was eerily silent as we filed out of the classroom, everyone moving in a daze. In the days that followed, no one spoke about what had happened. There were no explanations, no announcements, just a heavy silence that lingered like a storm cloud. But I knew, we all knew, that whatever those eyes were, they weren't gone. They were still there, hiding in the walls, watching us with their cold, unblinking gaze. And every time I walked past that classroom, I could feel them, just out of sight, waiting for the next time they would emerge from the shadows and remind us that we were never truly alone.